The late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the quiet streets of Merida, where mango trees leaned lazily over cracked sidewalks, and children's laughter carried in echoes from distant courtyards. In one modest house on the outskirts, a boy of only 5 years sat cross-legged on the tiled floor, his small hands tracing invisible shapes across the air, as though following the lines of a memory too heavy for his age. His name was Mateo, a curious child with dark curls, eyes wide and thoughtful, a boy who seemed in many ways ordinary. Yet in his speech and the sudden gravity that sometimes seized him, there was a difference that neither his parents nor their neighbors could dismiss. It began quietly, without spectacle. At first, Mateo spoke words his family did not recognize, syllables that rolled off his tongue, with a cadence that belonged to another time, another place. His mother, Inés, thought he was playing inventing nonsense songs, as children often did. But then came the moments when Mateo's tone changed solemn, steady, ancient. His father, Daniel, stopped him once in mid-chant, asking what language he was speaking. The boy shrugged as though the question itself was strange, and said simply, "It's how we prayed when we were in Egypt." The word struck like a chill wind. Egypt. Neither parent had ever spoken to him about such a place beyond vague references in church services, and certainly not with the detail that followed. That night, as they sat at the small kitchen table with plates of beans and tortillas untouched, Mateo began to recount visions that painted themselves before his eyes. He described the sting of whips against backs, the press of bodies in labor beneath a brutal sun, the bitter taste of tears swallowed in silence. His voice wavered, yet it carried a conviction so fierce that Inés clutched Daniel's hand beneath the table. Their son was not guessing. He was remembering. Days passed and the stories deepened. Mateo spoke of narrow alleys between mud-brick houses of torches, casting shadows across stone walls of Hebrew songs, whispered in secret when the overseers were gone. He named herbs used to soothe wounds, described carvings etched into amulets, worn for protection. And once, as if carried by instinct, he pressed his little palm against the wooden door of their home, and murmured about blood smeared on lintels to guard against the angel of death. The parents exchanged fearful glances. How could a 5-year-old in Merida, who had never traveled beyond the Yucatan, summon such images with such precision one afternoon, while the air outside shimmered with heat? Mateo's uncle arrived with a Bible in hand, curious to test the boy. Opening to the book of Exodus, he read passages aloud, halting unsure. At certain words, Mateo's eyes widened, and he interrupted to correct small details. How the bricks felt, heavier than the verse suggested. How the cries during the plagues sounded like rivers of grief. How the sea that parted was not quiet, but roared like a living beast. His uncle, pale and trembling, snapped the book shut. "He cannot know this," he whispered. "He should not know this." Word spread in the neighborhood, as it always does. Some dismissed it as imagination. Others whispered of possession of spirits lingering in children. But Inés could not dismiss the clarity in her son's eyes when he spoke of Moisés, the leader who lifted his staff against impossible odds. Mateo called him our shepherd, spoke of the night fires in the desert, the taste of manna that melted like dew upon the tongue. When asked how he knew, Mateo's answer was always the same, simple and unwavering. "Because I was there." Daniel, torn between disbelief and awe, decided to keep a small notebook. Each time his son spoke, he wrote quickly, capturing the words before they slipped away. Soon the pages filled with fragments of Hebrew phrases, sketches of pyramids and rivers, notes about rituals and punishments. It became a record not only of Mateo's strange memories, but of the family's descent into a mystery far larger than themselves. At night, lying awake, Daniel wondered if his boy's soul carried the echo of another life, a spark carried through centuries. Yet there were moments when Mateo remained only a child, laughing as he chased fireflies in the garden, falling asleep with his toy cars clutched in hand. The contrast made the other times the solemn, haunted storytelling all the more unsettling. For when his voice deepened, when the ancient language slipped through his lips, even the air in the room seemed to hold its breath. As weeks turned into months, the weight of his memories grew heavier. He spoke less of toys, more of temples. He dreamed at night and woke crying, saying he had seen waves rising higher than mountains, walls of water on either side, and people running across dry earth with terror and hope tangled in their hearts. His parents listened powerless, caught between wonder and dread. They feared for his innocence, yet could not silence the truth he carried. And thus, the story began, in that quiet Merida home, where a boy of 5 claimed with unwavering certainty that he had once lived and suffered and survived through the Exodus itself, walking with Moses beneath the burning sky. The weeks that followed were heavy with questions, and though the house on the quiet street looked the same to neighbors passing by inside its walls, the family felt as though they were standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. Daniel and Inés could not sleep soundly. Each night they lay awake replaying the words their son had spoken, searching for answers in silence. Could a child truly remember another life? Could the soul carry such vivid detail across centuries? Or was something else at work? An affliction, a trick of imagination, a shadow that had slipped into his innocence. They sought counsel first from the parish priest, Father Rodrigo, a man of 60 with kind eyes and deep creases carved by years of prayer. He listened with patience as Inés explained the strange words her son spoke, how he described rituals no child should know. Father Rodrigo leaned forward, folding his hands, and asked to meet the boy himself. When Mateo entered the rectory the following afternoon, he seemed smaller than ever, dwarfed by the tall ceilings and walls lined with saints. Yet when the priest asked gently about his dreams, Mateo lifted his chin and spoke of Moisés as though recalling a dear friend of the plagues with a clarity that left the room hushed. At one point he whispered words in the ancient tongue syllables so foreign that Father Rodrigo's eyes widened. Though he did not understand, he recognized the rhythm of prayer. The priest closed his eyes, murmured a blessing, and afterward told Daniel and Inés that while children could be impressionable, he could not dismiss the possibility that something divine or mysterious was unfolding. Guard his soul, he advised softly, and seek wisdom, not fear. But not all counsel was comforting. Daniel, determined to ground the matter in reason, reached out to a family friend at the university, Professor Esteban Marin, an archaeologist who had spent years studying ancient Near Eastern history. Skeptical by nature, Esteban arrived with a notebook and recorder intending to expose childish fantasy. Yet within an hour, his skepticism began to fray. Mateo described brick kilns, tools of bondage, and the patterns painted upon slave quarters with unnerving precision. He spoke of the Nile's floods of fish rotting under a crimson tide of a darkness so thick it suffocated the lungs. Esteban, accustomed to excavations and brittle scrolls, found himself sweating as the child's voice carried him to places no textbook could animate. At last he stopped the recorder and stared at Mateo. "Who told you this?" he demanded. The boy blinked, confused. "No one told me," he said. "I lived it. I was a son of Israel." The archaeologist left shaken, muttering about impossibilities, yet returning days later with books and maps. He tested Mateo relentlessly, names of cities, measurements of stone blocks, the sequence of plagues. Time and again the boy answered with startling coherence. Some details were even obscure things debated among scholars. Esteban confessed to Daniel one evening that Mateo's recollections matched certain archaeological findings he had never shared outside his circle. "If this is invention," he whispered, it is genius beyond comprehension. But if not, then we are faced with a mystery that bends the laws of time. The strain on the family grew. Inés clung to her son, protectively torn between wonder and dread. Neighbors grew wary, whispering that strange forces might haunt the boy. Some came out of curiosity, pressing for demonstrations, while others crossed themselves and avoided the house altogether. Mateo, caught between worlds, often played with his toys one moment, and then with sudden gravity described in detail how lambs were chosen for sacrifice. Their blood carefully brushed across door frames to protect families from a coming terror. His voice was steady, his eyes distant, as if watching it unfold before him. To ease their worry, Daniel sought the advice of a psychiatrist specializing in child development, Dr. Lucia Herrera. She visited with calm professionalism, kneeling to meet Mateo's gaze. For hours she observed him play, asked him questions, and recorded his responses. That evening she spoke quietly with the parents. "I have studied cases of vivid imagination, of trauma expressed through fantasy," she explained. "But this is different. His recall is too structured, too detailed, layered with knowledge he has no access to. I cannot explain it by psychology alone." She recommended continued observation, yet confessed privately that she too felt unsettled. As months passed, the boy's memories deepened, growing not weaker but stronger, as though some unseen hand was turning the pages of an ancient book inside him. He spoke not only of Egypt's cruelty, but of the wilderness of dust, clinging to bare feet, of thirst and hunger, answered by unexpected gifts from the sky. He described the moment the sea divided, not as a miracle told in church, but as an event he had seen with his own eyes. He said the wind howled like 1,000 beasts, the sand stung like needles, and the water stood upright, towering alive. These confessions drew the family into a storm they could not escape. Between faith, science, and fear, they balanced on a fragile line. Every expert who came left more questions than answers. Father Rodrigo prayed for them weekly. Esteban returned again and again with documents, and Dr. Herrera arranged sessions to track the boy's shifting states. Yet no one could deny the force of Mateo's words, nor the way his small body sometimes seemed to carry the weight of centuries. At night, when silence covered the city and only crickets sang, Daniel would sit by the window, notebook in hand, watching his son sleep. He felt both terrified and blessed, unsure whether this gift was holy or dangerous. Each new story, each new detail recorded in those pages bound them tighter to a mystery larger than any they had known. Mateo was not only their child, he was somehow a living vessel of history. And still the boy whispered in his dreams, calling upon names and places long buried, as though the desert winds of Exodus still howled through him, urging him to remember to speak, to bear witness. The turning point came one hot evening, when the cicadas screamed in the trees and the air felt heavy, as though a storm loomed just beyond the horizon. Mateo had been playing with a wooden cart when suddenly he froze, eyes fixed on something invisible before him. His small hands trembled, and he whispered words that carried the weight of command, a language that no one in the room understood. Inés rushed to his side, calling his name, but he did not seem to hear her. His voice grew louder, filled with urgency, as though he were warning others of a danger close at hand. When at last he collapsed into his mother's arms, his skin clammy, he whispered only one phrase: "The angel passes tonight." The family felt the chill of those words, as if the centuries themselves had slipped into their living room. Daniel immediately wrote it down, adding it to the growing pile of notebooks already heavy with descriptions of plagues, rituals, and visions. That night he sat awake, wondering if his son was reliving not just the Exodus, but specific nights of terror, carrying within him the cries of families huddled in Mvur as death moved across Egypt. The following days brought no relief. Mateo awoke crying, describing rivers that ran red frogs swarming over beds and the stench of decay. He spoke of mothers weeping over firstborn sons, of cries rising so loud that they drowned out the night itself. His words were too vivid, too heavy, too soaked in grief to come from a child's invention. Even Esteban, hardened by decades of skepticism, admitted that the boy's visions matched obscure texts describing the Egyptian night of mourning. "It is as if he was there," the archaeologist whispered, shaking his head. News of Mateo spread quietly, but persistently. Friends told friends, neighbors whispered in the market, and soon curious faces began appearing at the family's door. Some arrived reverently, hoping to hear prophecy. Others came out of fear, muttering about spirits or curses. Daniel and Inés tried to shield their son, but whispers are not easily silenced. Strangers would linger by the fence, pressing for stories, for proof, for a glimpse of the boy who spoke with the voice of the ancients. Under such pressure, Mateo grew restless. He would sit by the window at dusk, staring into the fading light as though waiting for something. Once, when asked what he saw, he answered softly, "The cloud moves. It leads us." He described a great pillar of smoke by day, fire by night, guiding a mass of people across desolate land. His words carried such conviction that even those who doubted felt unease settle into their bones. Dr. Herrera, determined to protect the boy from exploitation, began recording his accounts formally. She sat with him in a quiet room, letting him draw scenes on paper. What emerged were crude but startling sketches. Lines of figures crossing between two towering walls, waves curling like claws above them, a staff raised high against the wind. Tents clustered beneath a burning sun. Each drawing seemed to pour from him with urgency, as though the memories were pressing to escape. The more Mateo revealed, the more entangled the adults around him became. Esteban spent sleepless nights cross-referencing the boy's accounts with archaeological data, finding uncomfortable alignments. Father Rodrigo prayed longer in his chapel, kneeling until his knees ached, torn between awe and fear, that the child might be carrying a fragment of divine mystery. And Dr. Herrera, once anchored in science, confessed to Inés in a hushed tone that she dreamed of deserts and seas after every session with Mateo, as though his visions were seeping into her own subconscious. One afternoon, while playing in the garden, Mateo stopped abruptly, his eyes distant. He turned to his mother and said with chilling calm, "They are behind us. The chariots, the soldiers, they do not stop." He clutched her hand tightly, his breathing ragged as though the pursuit of Pharaoh's army were unfolding before his eyes. Inés held him, whispering comfort, but inside her chest, her heart thundered with dread. That evening, Daniel and Inés argued for the first time in months. He insisted they needed to withdraw from outsiders to protect their child from constant questioning and intrusion. She countered that perhaps sharing his gift was part of a larger purpose. "If this is truly from God," she said, "how can we keep it hidden?" Their voices rose, then fell into exhausted silence, both knowing there was no clear answer. Meanwhile, Mateo's body seemed to tire under the weight of his memories. He ate less, slept fitfully, and often stared into space for long stretches, lips moving in silent whispers. It was as though the stories he carried were not mere recollections, but burdens pressing down upon his small frame. Yet each time he was asked if he wished to stop, he would shake his head and insist, "I must remember. If I forget, they will be lost again." The family's home became a strange sanctuary, half refuge, half prison. The air within its walls carried tension, devotion, fear, and a sense that the ordinary world had slipped beyond reach. Outside, neighbors speculated, but inside, the mystery deepened. Mateo was no longer simply a boy with strange stories. He was becoming to those who listened a witness of Exodus itself, his young voice carrying the cries of a people long gone. And so the night stretched on each one, heavy with new visions, each dawn bringing new revelations that bound the family tighter to a truth they did not understand. Somewhere between faith and history, between innocence and burden, the little boy's journey pressed forward toward a climax none of them could yet see. The days grew hotter, the air thick with the scent of salt drifting from the coast, and Mateo's visions deepened with a force that unsettled everyone who heard them. No longer were his recollections brief fragments. They unfurled as long, seamless narratives spoken with the cadence of lived experience. His small body seemed fragile, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of an elder who had walked deserts and endured trials carved into the memory of a nation. One evening, just as twilight bathed the city in fading amber, Mateo asked for water and then began to describe without pause a scene so vivid that his parents felt as if the walls of their home dissolved around them. We reached the sea. He whispered, eyes distant. The waters stretched before us, endless dark. Behind us we heard the roar of chariots. The dust of their wheels rose like a storm. Mothers clutched their children. Men gripped staffs with trembling hands. We had nowhere to go. He spoke of the panic that rippled through the crowd of people, crying out in despair, their voices colliding with the crash of waves. He described the prophet Moises as he called him, raising his staff, his face lifted toward the heavens. The wind came, Mateo said, shivering, though the night was warm. It tore at our clothes, it burned our eyes, and then the waters pulled apart. He stretched his hands in opposite directions, as though mimicking the very sea splitting before his eyes. His voice shook but carried awe. Walls of water rose higher than any palm, higher than the cliffs. They curled and clawed at the sky, but they did not fall. A path opened, dry ground, and we walked. Inés wept silently, her arms wrapped around herself. Daniel scribbled furiously into his notebook, though his hands shook too much to keep pace. Even Esteban, who had returned reluctantly for another visit, sat with his mouth slightly open, unable to dismiss what he was hearing. Mateo continued, his words relentless. He described the fear of stepping into the path, of seeing shadows of fish flicker through the walls of water, of hearing the rumble above, as if the sea itself groaned under the strain of being held back. He spoke of walking for hours, his legs aching, every heartbeat pounding with the knowledge that death rode behind them. The soldiers followed. He murmured, his eyes unfocused. Their chariots rolled into the path. They shouted, their wheels cutting into the ground. But the waters waited. They waited until we were safe. When he spoke of the collapse, his small body convulsed with the force of the memory. He gasped, clutched at his chest, and whispered, "It fell." All at once. The roar was greater than thunder. Their cries were swallowed, their banners torn. The waters closed, and no one remained. The room fell into stunned silence. Inés pulled him close, whispering prayers into his hair. Father Rodrigo crossed himself repeatedly, tears running freely down his cheeks. Esteban looked away, struggling to reconcile the boy's words with the cold rationality of history. Over the following days, Mateo's accounts grew even more precise. He described the exhaustion of the journey after the crossing, the parched throats, the meager bread, the bitterness of herbs chewed only to stave off hunger. He spoke of disputes among the people, of voices raised in anger of doubt, gnawing at their faith, even in the shadow of miracles. His words carried not only detail, but also emotion, weariness, relief, and sometimes even resentment. Emotions too complex for a 5-year-old to fabricate. Dr. Herrera pressed gently, asking Mateo if he remembered what came after. He told her of encampments under the blazing sun, of tents flapping in the dry wind, of children chasing one another in the dust, even as parents argued about where the prophet led them. He described the taste of something sweet that fell with the dawn like dew, but different, he said, struggling for words. It melted on the tongue soft as bread from heaven. The psychiatrist stared at him. Her pen paused mid-sentence, chills running along her arms. But with each revelation, Mateo seemed to weaken. His cheeks hollowed slightly, his energy faded. He often fell asleep in the middle of meals or conversations, and when he woke, his eyes looked older, as if carrying centuries of fatigue. Inez grew frantic, pleading with her husband to seek answers beyond their circle. "He is fading," she whispered one night, clutching Daniel's hands. "Our boy is fading." The strain spread like cracks through the household. Daniel buried himself in research, surrounding himself with books on Hebrew history, archaeology, and theology, searching for anchors. Inez prayed fervently, lighting candles, until wax dripped like rivers down the altar she built in their living room. Esteban distanced himself, claiming he needed clarity, though his absence felt like betrayal. Only Father Rodrigo remained steady, sitting with Mateo in silence, offering gentle prayers as though to shield the boy from forces unseen. Despite their fear, the family could not deny the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Mateo was not only recalling, but reliving each vision, an echo so tangible that it spilled into the present, shaking everyone around him. Their home, once filled with laughter and the ordinary chaos of family life, had become a threshold, a place where past and present converged. And through it all, Mateo clung to a single certainty. "We were chosen," he whispered one night as his mother tucked him in. His voice trembled, but his eyes burned with conviction. "Even when we doubted, even when we were afraid, we were chosen." And I was there. The words lingered in the dark, reverberating through the silence, a reminder that his journey was not yet complete, that more memories, more burdens lay ahead. The days blurred into a strange rhythm where Mateo's body remained in Merida, but his words seemed to pour from another century altogether. He awoke whispering of desert winds that scraped the skin raw of tents, shuddering beneath invisible pressure of a people caught between hunger and revelation. His parents carried him outside, hoping sunlight might ground him. But he only squinted toward the horizon, as if expecting a column of fire to descend. One evening, as neighbors gathered to ask after the boy, Mateo suddenly raised his hand and spoke with an authority that made grown men still their breathing. He described a trembling mountain, lit as if from within, wrapped in smoke that writhed like living fabric. The sound, he said, was unlike thunder or storm, but closer to a voice too vast to bear. "We were forbidden to cross," he explained softly. Eyes wide but distant. Only the prophet climbed. If we touched the mountain, it would devour us. His words left the courtyard silent. Father Rodrigo crossed himself while Esteban scribbled furiously in his notebook, the archaeologist's skepticism eroding with every uncanny detail. Later, Dr. Herrera asked him gently how he could know such things. Mateo frowned, then pointed at his chest. "Because I was there. I carried water. I listened. I saw the covenant fire burn the air." He spoke of the waiting, how the people fashioned ornaments, grew restless, begged for a God they could see. He recounted the sound of hammers against gold, shaping a calf whose gleam reflected their fear. His mother gasped, recognizing the tale from catechism lessons. But in Mateo's telling, it was no fable. His description was visceral, the smell of molten metal, the shadows of dancers whirling in desperate abandon, the sudden cry when wrath descended upon them. The family wrestled with his testimony. Was this holy possession ancestral memory or illness, clothed in sacred imagery? Esteban insisted no 5-year-old could conjure such archaeological accuracy. The tent arrangement, the separation of the Levites, the mention of ram's horns echoing against rock. Father Rodrigo urged prayer, believing perhaps God allowed the boy to remember so that faith would not be lost in an age of doubt. Herrera warned of the psychological toll that Mateo's frail body could not endure the weight of two lives pressing upon one fragile soul. Yet Mateo seemed compelled, almost consumed by these recollections. He spoke until exhaustion bent his small frame, then collapsed into uneasy sleep. When asked later what frightened him most, he whispered, "Not the fire, not the thunder. The silence after. It was too big, and I was too small." His parents held him close, uncertain whether they were comforting a sick child or a witness chosen to carry fragments of the oldest story of all. And still the boy insisted there was more to tell, that his journey did not end at the mountain, but stretched into wandering hunger and promises waiting in the dust. Nights in the house grew longer as Mateo's body weakened, yet his words unfurled with a clarity that unsettled everyone who listened. He spoke less as a child and more as a weary traveler recounting burdens carried long ago. His parents lit candles at dusk, hoping to steady his rest. But when the flames flickered, he whispered, "It was like that in the desert, too light given for the night cloud for the day. So we did not lose our way." He described mornings where dew shimmered on the barren ground until it hardened into thin flakes, bread-like and sweet. The people called it, "What is this manna?" and it became their daily sustenance. He told of children rushing to gather it before the sun erased it, of mothers grinding it into cakes of elders, warning not to hoard because it spoiled overnight. He even remembered the exception on the eve of rest, when double portion was gathered and preserved unspoiled proof of providence woven into their hunger. The archaeologist Esteban leaned closer each time Mateo spoke, recognizing details buried in texts not commonly taught. The boy mimicked how the flakes stuck to fingers, how impatient men muttered demanding meat instead of the strange bread. Mateo's voice faltered, then grew firm. Quail came so many that wings darkened the camp. We ate until we could not move. His father, Alejandro, stared in awe, recalling that no child raised in Merida's modest schools could invent such sensory fragments of the ancient wilderness. But Mateo also recounted bitterness, the absence of water, the complaints rising like smoke. He told of a prophet striking stone so streams gushed forth of parched lips pressed against sudden pools of laughter, mixing with disbelief. He whispered of serpents slithering into camp, when the disobedience spread, of cries that split the night of healing, granted when eyes lifted to a bronze image raised high. These stories poured from him with anguish, as though each memory pressed weight upon his small chest. Dr. Herrera worried aloud, noting the toll-pallor trembling hands nights, where Mateo woke gasping, whispering about endless walking sand, scouring skin raw. The psychiatrist urged moderation. Yet no one could stop the tide of memory. Father Rodrigo prayed over the boy, confessing that though he feared possession, he also marveled at the sacred coherence of the testimony. The neighbors whispered that God had sent a messenger into their midst, though some warned that such mysteries often demanded painful sacrifice. One evening, Mateo lifted his face pale in the candlelight and declared that the wandering had no end in sight, that they walked not just across land, but across generations. He claimed he still remembered faces, fading graves dug hastily, hope carried by children when their elders fell. His mother clutched him tightly, tears soaking his hair, unsure if she held her son or a vessel of ancient sorrow. And yet, in the midst of despair, Mateo's voice brightened when he spoke of promises whispered under starlight, of a land not yet reached but believed in fiercely, where rivers flowed and harvests would come. He sighed, closed his eyes, and murmured, "We never stopped walking. Even now we are still walking." Mateo's voice grew fainter with each passing day, as though the weight of centuries pressed down upon his 5-year-old frame. Yet even in weakness, his eyes gleamed with a strange fire, pulling his parents' neighbors and the small circle of scholars and clergy into a silence that felt almost liturgical. At times he lay motionless for hours, then suddenly sat upright to deliver fragments of memory that seemed etched not in the mind of a child, but in the marrow of history itself. He spoke of a people still wandering, of generations born beneath canvas of elders buried in shifting dunes. His voice trembled as he remembered how each grave was marked with stones, cairns rising briefly before being swallowed by wind. "We kept walking," he murmured, "even when the sand took our dead." The children carried hope for the old. He described hearing ancient songs low and mournful, then soaring with defiance, promising that the journey would not be in vain. One night he startled awake, clutching his mother's hand, whispering of a prophet gazing from a mountain, eyes wet with both joy and grief. He saw it, but did not enter. Mateo set his small fingers trembling. He gave us words instead, laws to bind us a promise greater than his own life. His mother wept openly, recognizing in his words the end of Moses' long journey, though no one had spoken such names to the boy. The household became a chamber of reverence and fear. Esteban confessed he could no longer dismiss what he heard: too many archaeological parallels, too much precision beyond coincidence. Father Rodrigo, torn between faith and dread, began recording Mateo's words, believing they might carry some divine charge. Dr. Herrera grew pale and quiet, whispering that perhaps the boy bore memories no human should contain. Yet as vivid as his testimony remained, Mateo's body betrayed him. He tired after only a few sentences, his skin waxen, his breath shallow. At times he no longer recognized the present he called his parents by ancient names, reached for water as though from a desert spring, or whispered to companions long buried. His father held him tighter each time, fearing the moment when even the fragile tether to this life would slip. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the visions ebbed. Mateo lay still, eyes heavy-lidded, and when he spoke, it was of simple things again. Bread from the market games with neighbors, his favorite lullaby. The vast desert receded, the thundering mountain grew silent, the Red Sea closed behind him. His parents, bewildered, did not know whether to rejoice at his return or mourn the loss of something miraculous. Weeks passed, and the boy began to run and laugh again, as though a shadow had lifted. The scholars drifted away, the priest visited less often, and the neighbors whispered stories that blurred into legend, yet his parents never forgot. For them, every time Mateo laughed in the courtyard or chased birds at dawn, they remembered the child who had once spoken in the voice of exile, law, and promise. They did not know whether God had chosen their son as a vessel, or whether memory itself had leapt the gulf of centuries to inhabit a fragile frame. But they knew this: the desert had passed through him, leaving its imprint on their lives forever. And though Mateo grew forgetting the weight of visions he had carried, the silence he left behind was never empty. It throbbed with awe, with mystery, with the echo of an ancient people who had once walked through fire and water toward a land promised but unseen.